The rifle lay across Wesley Fletcher's saddle horn, and every man in Ellsworth County could see his finger was nowhere near the trigger, which was the only reason Letitia Talbot was still breathing. She stood in the dust of Cottonwood Crossing with her medical bag clutched against her chest, close enough to Judge Horace Beeman's ruined bridge timbers to smell the pitch, and she watched 4 men on horseback fan out in a slow half-circle around the wagon she had spent the last 2 days protecting. Inside that wagon, wrapped in a horse blanket and shaking with fever, was a 15-year-old boy named Amos Reyes, the only living witness against Silas Corrigan's foreman for the murder of a Mexican drover on the Corrigan Range 3 weeks past. The men circling the wagon worked for Silas Corrigan. Everyone in 3 counties knew it, though none of them would say it to a lawman's face, because in this stretch of Kansas, Silas Corrigan was closer to the law than the circuit judge was. "You are going to want to step back from that wagon, ma'am," said the lead rider, a broad man named Purcell with a scar through one eyebrow. "This does not concern a lady doctor." "It concerns me the moment you point a rifle at my patient," Letitia said, and she did not step back. Her voice did not shake, though her knees wanted to. She had learned a long time ago that a doctor who flinched lost the patient before she lost anything else. Wesley Fletcher walked his horse forward, unhurried, the way he moved a wagon train across a river with a bad current, like haste was the one luxury the frontier could not afford him. He was 34 years old, sun-creased at the eyes, with hands that had guided 40 wagons and 200 people from Independence to the Kansas railheads over 11 years, and he had buried enough of those people to know exactly what a gun pointed at the wrong moment could cost. "Purcell," Wesley said, and there was no anger in it, only a flat certainty that made men listen. "You know me. I have hauled freight past your outfit a dozen times, and I never gave your boss cause to hate me. I am asking you now, man to man, to turn around and ride back to Corrigan and tell him the judge already has federal marshals riding down from Fort Riley, and if that boy in the wagon comes to harm before he testifies, there is not enough grass in Kansas to hide behind." It was not entirely true about the marshals. Judge Beeman had sent one letter requesting federal assistance and had received no answer at all, which was precisely why Wesley and Letitia had been ordered together, reluctantly, to carry the boy and the sworn evidence 60 miles east to the railhead court at Ellsworth, before Corrigan's people could make the witness disappear the way they had made 2 others disappear that summer. Purcell's eyes moved from Wesley's rifle, resting easy across the saddle, to Letitia's steady stance, to the wagon, and back to Wesley's face. 4 against 1 gun raised was not good odds for Purcell if the marshals were real, and Purcell had not stayed alive as long as he had by betting wrong on things like that. "You are a fool, Fletcher," Purcell said at last. "Man could get paid well for looking the other way." "I expect he could," Wesley agreed. "I expect he could also get hanged for it once the wind changes. Wind is changing, Purcell. I can feel it." The second stretched. Letitia realized she had stopped breathing and made herself start again, slow, through her nose, the way she steadied her own hands before surgery. She looked at Wesley Fletcher's back, at the set of his shoulders, and understood that he was not performing courage for her benefit. He simply intended to be the last man standing between 4 riders and a sick boy, and he intended it so plainly that the 4 riders believed him before he had proven a thing. Purcell spat into the dust, wheeled his horse, and the 4 of them rode back toward the Corrigan spread without another word, and no shot had been fired, not one, and Letitia's hands were still shaking as she climbed back into the wagon to check on Amos Reyes. That was the first day. There would be 11 more before it was finished, and neither Wesley Fletcher nor Letitia Talbot yet understood that the standoff at Cottonwood Crossing had not ended their trouble at all. It had only opened the door to it. The year was 1878, the last week of September, and the whole of central Kansas smelled of cut wheat and cattle dust, of harvest bonfires and the particular sweetness of apples going soft in orchard grass. Ellsworth itself sat swollen with the season, crowded with Texas drovers finishing the long cattle drives up from the Kishom Trail, with grain speculators come to bid on the harvest, with homesteading families passing through on their way to claims further west, and with the kind of hired men who drifted toward any town where money and desperation both pooled thick. It had been Judge Beeman's idea to send them together, though neither Wesley nor Letitia had wanted it. "You have got the only wagon in this county built strong enough and quiet enough to move a sick boy 60 miles without killing him," the judge had told Wesley 2 days before the standoff, sitting behind his cluttered desk with a lamp burning low against the evening. "And Dr. Talbot is the only physician within 100 miles willing to keep that boy alive long enough to reach my courtroom. I am not asking either of you because I like the arrangement. I am asking because Corrigan owns half the men who call themselves law in this county, and if I send that boy alone with a deputy, he will be dead in a ditch by Thursday." Wesley had looked across the desk at the woman standing near the window, tall and composed in a gray traveling dress with her dark hair pinned severe against the autumn light, and he had felt something in him resist the arrangement immediately, though he could not at that moment have said exactly why. "I work alone, Judge," he had said. "Faster that way, safer for everybody. I have crossed the Cimarron in flood season with nothing but a mule and a medical bag," Letitia had answered before the judge could speak, her voice cool and precise. "I do not require an escort, Mr. Fletcher. I require a wagon that will not jolt a fevered boy to death before we reach a courtroom, and I am told yours is the only one in the county fit for the purpose. That boy needs more than a smooth wagon, ma'am. He needs somebody who can put a bullet in a man before that man puts one in him. And he needs someone who can keep the wound in his side from turning to blood poisoning before we arrive." Letitia had returned, not raising her voice at all, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. "I have watched men die of infected wounds who would have lived if a fool with a gun had not been so busy protecting them from bullets that never came, while forgetting the fever that was already killing them. I suspect you have watched people die too, Mr. Fletcher. I suspect you know exactly which kind of death is more common out here." The judge had watched this exchange with the weary patience of a man who had presided over a great many arguments he had no intention of losing, and when it was finished he had simply said, "You will travel together. That is the order of this court. I am sorry for both your objections, but I have buried too many witnesses already, and I intend to bury no more." So they had traveled together, and on the second day out from the judge's chambers, Silas Corrigan's men had found them at Cottonwood Crossing, where the old timber bridge across Elk Creek had partly collapsed the spring before and never been properly repaired, forcing every wagon on that stretch of road to ford the shallows beside it instead. It was there in the ford, with the wagon half stuck in gravel and Amos Ray's burning with fever inside it, that Purcell and his 3 riders had come upon them. And it was there that Wesley Fletcher had ended a fight before it began, with nothing but a rifle he never raised and a voice he never lifted. Letitia had not expected that of him. She had expected, from what little the judge had said of Wesley Fletcher's reputation as a wagon master, a man who solved problems with force because force was the only tool he trusted. Instead, she had watched him solve a problem with patience and a carefully weighted bluff, protecting 4 lives without spending a single bullet, and something in her private assessment of him had shifted, though she was not yet ready to call it trust. That evening, camped a mile past the crossing in a stand of cottonwoods gone gold with the season, Letitia knelt beside Amos Ray's and pressed her palm to his forehead while Wesley built up the fire against the cooling night. "How bad?" Wesley asked, not looking up from the flames. "His fever is down half a degree since this morning. The wound is draining clean, which is good, but I do not like how tired he is. A boy his age should have more fight in him. He watched a man get shot to death 3 weeks ago and has been running ever since. I expect the fight got used up some." Letitia glanced at him across the fire. "You know his story." I know Corrigan's foreman, man named Dietz, shot a drover named Rafael Ochoa over a wage dispute, and this boy saw the whole of it from behind the corral fence and was fool enough, or brave enough, to tell a deputy what he saw. I know 2 other witnesses to Corrigan business have disappeared this year, and nobody has found so much as a boot. I know Judge Beeman is the only man in 3 counties still willing to try Corrigan's people in an honest court, and I know if we do not get this boy to Ellsworth alive, that will be the end of it, and Corrigan will own this county free and clear. You sound like a man who has thought about this a great deal for someone who claims to work alone and want no part of the judge's arrangement. Wesley finally looked up, and in the firelight his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's ride. I lost a family on the trail once, ma'am. Whole wagon party cholera back in '69. 19 souls, and I could not save but 6 of them, and I have spent every crossing since trying to make sure it does not happen again on my watch. When a boy needs protecting and a judge asks me to see it done, I do not much care what shape my objections take. I will see it done. Letitia said nothing for a moment, only studied him across the fire, this man who wore his grief like a tool belt, practical and always at hand. That is the first true thing you have said to me since we left Judge Beeman's office, she said finally. I have said several true things. You have said several correct things. There is a difference. She turned back to Amos, adjusting the blanket over his thin shoulders. I lost a husband to a fever I could not break 3 years ago in Missouri, before I learned enough medicine to have saved him. I do not tell people that because it invites pity, and I have no use for pity. I tell you because you have just told me something true, and I find I would rather match it than let it sit alone. Wesley did not answer right away. The fire popped, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a night bird called twice and went quiet. I am sorry for your husband, he said at last. I am sorry for your wagon party. She met his eyes. It seems we are both people who took up hard work because someone we loved could not be saved by anyone. It was the first moment of real understanding between them, small and unremarkable to look at. 2 tired people sharing grief across a campfire while a sick boy slept between them. But it settled something in Wesley Fletcher's chest that he had not expected. A recognition that the woman across the fire was not simply an obstacle to his plan for keeping the boy safe, but a person who had chosen her own hard road for reasons as deep as his own. They reached Ellsworth on the 5th day, later than planned because the ford at Cottonwood Crossing had cost them half a day's travel, and because Amos Ray's fever had spiked again on the 3rd night, requiring a full day's rest while Letitia worked over him with willow bark tea and cold compresses, and a patience that Wesley found himself watching more than he meant to. Ellsworth in late September was a town bursting past its own boundaries. Cattle pens along the rail spur held thousands of head bawling and shifting in the dust, waiting for the buyers who had come out from Kansas City and Chicago. The main street was a churn of drovers fresh off the trail spending 3 months' wages in a single week, of grain wagons lined up outside the elevator, of tents pitched in every vacant lot for the overflow of a county fair that had drawn families from 50 miles in every direction. The air smelled of manure and roasting corn and gun oil, and underneath it all, the sharp green smell of the cottonwoods along the Smoky Hill River turning color with the season. Judge Beeman's courtroom, such as it was, occupied the 2nd floor of the land office, and it was there that Wesley and Letitia delivered Amos Ray's on the afternoon of the 5th day, thinner and pale but alive, his sworn testimony still intact in the sealed envelope Letitia had carried against her own body the entire journey, tucked beneath her dress where no thief's careless hand would find it without a fight. Judge Beeman received them with visible relief, and immediately with new worry. Corrigan knows the boy is here, he told them, pacing behind his desk. I have had 3 separate parties come through my office today asking after him, polite as church deacons, every one of them working for Corrigan whether they say so or not. The trial is set for 1 week from today. That is 1 week we need to keep this boy breathing, and 1 week in a town crowded with Corrigan's money. We will need a place to keep him that is not obvious, Letitia said. Somewhere I can continue his treatment without every drover and speculator in Ellsworth knowing his address. I have a room behind the doctor's office that stands empty since old Doc Willoughby passed last spring, the judge said. You may use it, Dr. Talbot, and welcome, seeing as this county has had no permanent physician since Willoughby died and every family for 30 miles has been begging for one. It was, Letitia thought, both a kindness and a trap, the way most kindnesses in her profession tended to be. A room to work from meant a place to be found. But it also meant, for the first time in the 2 years since her husband's death and her decision to become the itinerant doctor no town would fund a permanent post for, an offer of something like a settled place, however temporary. Wesley, for his part, found himself less inclined than ever to simply hand the boy over and ride on to his next contract, a wagon train of homestead families waiting to cross the Smoky Hill on their way to claims near Fort Hays. He told himself it was because the job was not finished until the trial concluded. He did not examine too closely why the thought of leaving Letitia Talbot to guard a witness alone, in a town crawling with Corrigan's men, felt like leaving a job undone in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation. That night, after Amos was settled in the small room behind the doctor's office with a deputy posted at the door on the judge's orders, Wesley found Letitia on the boardwalk outside, watching the lamplit chaos of Ellsworth's Main Street with an expression he could not read. "You did fine work these 5 days," he said, coming to stand beside her, not too close. "So did you." She glanced at him. "I confess I expected less patience from a man who introduced himself by telling me he works alone. I have found patience useful over the years. A man who draws a gun first usually finds out too late he drew it for the wrong reason." He paused. "I meant what I said at the crossing, though. About Purcell. If he had called my bluff, I would have had to make good on it, and I do not enjoy those odds 4 against 1, even when I am fairly sure of how it will go." "Were you frightened?" The question surprised him, coming from her, direct as always. "Some," he admitted. "Not for myself so much, for the boy, for you." He heard himself say it and felt an odd warmth climb his neck. "I have hauled a great many wagons of settlers across a great many rivers, Dr. Talbot, and I have learned that fear for yourself makes a man careless, but fear for someone else, properly used, makes a man careful. I was careful today because I did not want anything to happen to either of you." Letitia studied him in the lamplight, this weathered, quiet man who had just admitted something that cost him effort to say. "That is a generous way to describe protecting a stranger," she said, though her voice had softened. "You are not entirely a stranger anymore," Wesley said. 5 days on a hard road together tends to change that." She almost smiled. It was the first almost smile he had gotten from her, and he found he wanted very badly to see the rest of it someday. The trial did not begin as scheduled. Instead, 4 days later, on a cool October morning with frost still silvering the grass along the Smoky Hill, word came into Ellsworth that the timber bridge at Cottonwood Crossing, the very one Wesley and Letitia had forded around on their journey east, had finally given way entirely in the night, its rotted center span collapsing into Elk Creek and taking with it the only reliable crossing on the main road between Ellsworth and the western settlements. A dozen homestead families, the very wagon train Wesley had been contracted to guide onward to Fort Hays once his current obligation ended, were stranded on the far side, along with grain wagons trying to reach the Ellsworth elevator before the buyers left town, and more urgently for the matter of Amos Ray's trial. 2 of the judge's subpoenaed witnesses who lived on ranches west of the crossing and could not reach Ellsworth to testify. Judge Beeman, faced with a trial that could not proceed without witnesses who could not cross the river, reluctantly postponed the proceedings by 10 days and dispatched word that the county would need the bridge repaired, and repaired fast, before the postponement became a permanent excuse for Corrigan's lawyers to have the case dismissed for lack of a complete record. Wesley Fletcher had built and repaired more river crossings than any 3 men in the county combined, a fact the judge remembered within the hour. "I need you out there, Fletcher," the judge said, catching him outside the land office. "You know timber work, you know river crossings, and half those stranded families were counting on you to guide them onward regardless. Take a crew, take what lumber the mill here can spare, and get that bridge passable before Corrigan's people decide a 10-day delay is worth turning into a permanent one." "And the boy?" Wesley asked. "And Dr. Talbot?" "Dr. Talbot has agreed to keep tending Amos here in town, under guard, and frankly I would rather you were fixing my only western crossing than standing watch over a door. A deputy can watch just as well. Corrigan is not fool enough to attack the boy openly in the middle of town, with the whole county watching. His danger is subtler than that. The bridge, Fletcher, is the danger I can see plainly, and it needs your hands, not your rifle." Wesley did not love the plan, but he understood the judge's reasoning, and there was a bridge full of stranded, frightened families on the other side of that ruined crossing who needed someone competent to see them safely through, families not unlike the one he had lost 11 years before. He found Letitia in the little clinic room behind the doctor's office, changing the dressing on Amos's healing wound, and told her of the arrangement. "You are leaving," she said, not quite a question, and something crossed her face too quickly for him to name it before she smoothed it away. "For a handful of days. The judge wants that bridge fixed before the delay becomes a weapon in Corrigan's hands, and I am the only man in the county who has built one strong enough to hold a loaded grain wagon. And you trust me to keep Amos safe without you standing over my shoulder." There was an edge in it, and Wesley heard it clearly enough to know he had, without meaning to, spent the last week making decisions about her safety without asking her opinion of them, the way he might have organized a wagon train without consulting the families in it, because that had always been his job and his right on the trail. He saw, suddenly, that it might not sit the same way with a woman who had crossed flooded rivers alone with nothing but a mule and her own competence. "I trust you," he said carefully, "more than I have trusted anyone in a long while to do a hard job right. I am not leaving because I doubt you. I am leaving because there is a bridge full of stranded people who need building skills I have, and you do not, same as there is a fevered boy in that bed who needs doctoring skills you have and I do not. That is not distrust, Dr. Talbot. That is simply what each of us is for." Letitia set down the fresh bandage roll and looked at him fully. "That is the first time you have spoken to me as though my judgment mattered as much as my usefulness," she said. "I find I like it a great deal better." "I am trying to learn the difference," Wesley admitted. "It does not come natural to a man who has spent 11 years being the one who decides when a wagon train stops and starts. I am used to deciding for people because deciding for them keeps them alive. I am beginning to understand that is not always the same as respecting them." "No," she agreed. "It is not. But I will grant you this much, Mr. Fletcher. It is a rare man who notices the difference at all, let alone says so out loud." He left for Cottonwood Crossing the next morning with a wagon of lumber from the Ellsworth mill and 4 hired men, and Letitia stood on the boardwalk to watch him go, and found herself standing there rather longer than the departure of a wagon train strictly required. The work at the crossing was harder than Wesley had hoped and more dangerous than he had told the judge, because within 2 days of his arrival it became clear that the bridge's collapse had not been simple rot and river current after all. The center span support pilings, when he examined them by wading into the cold shallows himself, showed clean saw marks beneath the waterline, cuts made deliberately, weeks before, time to weaken the structure until autumn rains and cattle traffic finished the job. Someone had wanted that bridge to fail, and failed during the very week that witnesses needed to cross it to reach Ellsworth for a trial against Silas Corrigan's foreman. Wesley said nothing of this to the stranded families camped on both banks, not wanting to spark panic among people already frightened and impatient. but he sent a rider back to Ellsworth with a sealed note for Judge Beeman detailing what he had found, and he doubled the watch on his own camp at night, sleeping with his rifle close at hand for the first time since the standoff at the ford. The repair itself was punishing labor, wading in water gone bitter with the first real cold of the season, setting new pilings by hand with block and tackle, sawing and fitting timber salvaged from the mill, and from two families' spare wagon lumber donated for the cause once Wesley explained what was at stake. He worked from before dawn until well past dark, driving himself and his crew hard, because every day the crossing remained impassable was another day Silas Corrigan had to work whatever scheme he was building against the trial, and another day Letitia Talbot stood in Ellsworth with a target on the room behind her clinic. He thought of her more than he meant to, in the gaps between labor, hauling timber and hearing her voice in his memory instead, the precise dry humor she used to keep her own fear at bay, the steadiness of her hands over Amos's wound, the moment on the boardwalk when she had told him she liked it better when he treated her judgment as equal to her usefulness. He found himself wanting to be the kind of man who remembered that lesson permanently, not merely when it was convenient. On the fourth day, with the new center span framed but not yet decked, one of the stranded homestead family's youngest children, a boy of about 6, slipped down the muddy bank while playing too near the water and was swept a dozen yards downstream before Wesley, working waist deep in the current fitting a support brace, caught the flash of the child's blue shirt and lunged after him without a moment's hesitation, catching the boy's collar just as the current tried to pull him under a snag of drift lumber. He hauled the child, coughing and terrified but alive, up onto the bank into his mother's arms, and stood there dripping and shaking with the cold and the fright of it, and thought, unbidden, that this was precisely the kind of moment that would once have convinced him he alone was capable of keeping people safe, that other hands could not be trusted with a task this important. But watching the boy's mother clutch her son and weep with relief, Wesley found himself thinking instead of Letitia, of how she would have known exactly what to do for a half-drowned child's lungs, how her steady competence would have made the rescue complete rather than merely urgent. And he understood, standing there soaked to the bone in the cold October water, that he did not want to keep being the only capable hands in every crisis for the rest of his life. He wanted a partner whose skill matched his own, and he wanted, with a suddenness that startled him, for that partner to be her. The bridge was passable by the 6th day, decked and braced and tested first by an empty wagon, and then, when it held true, by the full weight of the stranded grain wagons and homestead families who crossed it with visible relief, thanking Wesley with a warmth that embarrassed him more than it pleased him. He sent the homestead families on toward Fort Hays with a hired guide he trusted, since his own obligation to Judge Beeman was not yet finished, and he rode back toward Ellsworth with his crew and his findings about the sawed pilings, eager, more than he examined too closely, to see Letitia Talbot again. He arrived back in Ellsworth on the evening of the 7th day to find the town in a different kind of tension than the one he had left. Word had spread, in the way word always spread in a crowded railhead town, that Silas Corrigan himself had come into Ellsworth 2 days before, ostensibly to attend the cattle sales and the tail end of the county fair, and had been seen dining publicly with the county sheriff and 2 of the men who sat on the jury pool for the upcoming trial. It was not a crime to eat dinner with a sheriff. It was, however, precisely the kind of quiet, deniable pressure that Corrigan had built his power on for a decade, reminding every man in town who held the real authority in that county, regardless of what the judge's docket said. Wesley found Letitia in the clinic, treating a drover's broken finger from a fairground wrestling match, and waited until the man had gone before speaking. "I heard about Corrigan's dinner," he said. "The whole town has heard about it," Letitia said, cleaning her instruments with brisk, controlled movements that told Wesley she was more unsettled than she wanted to appear. "He has not said one improper word to anyone, of course." He simply eats his supper where the whole town can watch him eat it with the sheriff and lets everyone imagine what conversations happen in private. It is a kind of violence, Mr. Fletcher, done entirely without weapons. I find I have less patience for it than I did for Purcell's riflemen at the crossing. At least that danger announced itself honestly. How is Amos? Healing well. Physically, at least. He is frightened, and I cannot blame him. He asked me yesterday whether it would not be simpler for everyone if he simply said he saw nothing at all. What did you tell him? I told him that a lie to save himself might feel simpler today, but it would follow him the rest of his life, the way an infected wound follows a man who ignores it, growing worse in the dark until it kills something in him even if it does not kill his body. I told him the truth was worth the fear if he could find the courage to carry it that far. She set down her cleaning cloth and looked at Wesley properly for the first time since he had entered. You look tired, and you are limping slightly. Pulled something hauling timber. It is nothing. He hesitated, then told her of the sawed pilings, of the deliberate sabotage that had turned a simple river crossing into a weapon against the trial's timeline, and watched her face harden with the particular anger she reserved for injustice rather than mere danger to herself. He is trying to strangle this trial with delay and intimidation, rather than risk an outright killing that might finally turn public opinion against him, Letitia said. It is almost more frightening than Purcell's rifle because it is so patient. Then we will have to be more patient than he is, Wesley said. The bridge is fixed. The witnesses from the west side can cross now. The trial can proceed on schedule. That is one weapon taken out of his hands already. One of several, I suspect. Letitia's eyes met his, steady despite the worry in them. I am glad you are back, Mr. Fletcher. I did not realize how much I had grown accustomed to your presence until you were gone 6 days on the other side of that river. It was as close as she had come yet to admitting the shift that had happened between them, and Wesley felt it land in his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold ride back from the crossing. I found I thought of you a great deal more than the job strictly required, he admitted. I told myself it was concern for Amos's safety. I am no longer entirely certain that was the whole truth of it. Letitia's composure flickered, just slightly, a small breach in the careful control she kept over her own feelings. I have not allowed myself to think too far down that road, Mr. Fletcher. I built this profession, this independence, out of the wreckage of losing my husband, and I have grown protective of it in a way that makes me wary of any arrangement that might ask me to set it aside. I would never ask that of you, Wesley said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised him with its depth. I have spent this whole week learning the difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. I do not intend to forget the lesson the moment it becomes inconvenient. They stood there a moment longer, the lamplight warm between them, the sounds of Ellsworth's crowded evening drifting through the window, and something passed between them that was not quite a promise yet, but was no longer simply professional respect either. The trial resumed 3 days later, and Ellsworth's land office was packed to its walls with spectators drawn by the drama of it. Drovers and homesteaders and speculators crowding the narrow room to watch Judge Beeman preside over what everyone in the county understood to be a test of whether Silas Corrigan's money could still outweigh the law in Ellsworth County. Amos Reyes testified on the second day of proceedings, his voice thin but steady, describing in plain, unadorned words the argument he had witnessed between Corrigan's foreman Dietz and the drover Rafael Ochoa. The shot fired without warning, the way Ochoa had fallen and not risen again. Letitia sat in the front row throughout, close enough that Amos could find her steady face whenever his courage wavered, and Wesley stood near the back of the room, not because he doubted the boy's safety inside a crowded courtroom in broad daylight, but because he had learned, finally, to let Letitia be the visible support the boy needed while he kept watch for dangers she could not see from where she sat. Corrigan's lawyer, a sharp man brought up from Wichita for the occasion, tried every method he knew to shake the boy's testimony, suggesting he had misremembered the distance, the light, the angle, suggesting he bore some grudge against the foreman, suggesting his fever during the journey to Ellsworth had addled his memory of events that happened weeks before he ever fell ill. Amos held his ground through all of it, occasionally glancing at Letitia, who gave him nothing more than a small, steady nod each time, the kind of wordless reassurance that told him she believed him, and that belief cost her nothing to give. That evening, after the day's proceedings adjourned with the jury clearly rattled by the boy's steady testimony, Silas Corrigan himself approached Letitia outside the land office, a lean gray-haired man with the soft-spoken courtesy of someone who had never needed to raise his voice because other men always raised weapons on his behalf instead. "Dr. Talbot," he said, tipping his hat with old-fashioned formality, "I understand this county owes you thanks for keeping that boy alive to testify. Whatever the jury decides, that is fine doctoring. I did my work, Mr. Corrigan, nothing more remarkable than that. Modest, too, a rare quality." He studied her a moment, and something colder moved behind his pleasant expression. "This county has needed a permanent physician for some time now, Dr. Talbot. I would be glad to see that need filled by someone of your evident skill. I own considerable property near the western edge of the county, several thousand acres, in fact, and I would be pleased to fund a proper clinic there, staffed by a doctor of my choosing, with a salary that would free you from the itinerant life entirely. A woman of your talents deserves better than dusty roads and borrowed rooms behind a dead man's old office." The offer, dressed as generosity, was unmistakably something else, a suggestion that her usefulness might be purchased away from the trial's outcome, or perhaps simply a demonstration of the reach of his money, that he could offer to remake her entire profession with a gesture, the same way he had remade the county's law with private dinners and quiet threats. "I am flattered, Mr. Corrigan," Letitia said, matching his cold courtesy with her own, "but I find I prefer to choose my own patients and my own conditions, rather than have them chosen for me by a man whose foreman is presently on trial for murder. I hope you will understand my hesitation." Something flickered in Corrigan's pale eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "A pity," he said. "I had hoped we might come to a more comfortable arrangement. Good evening, Dr. Talbot." He walked away without another word, and Letitia found her hands trembling slightly as she watched him go, not from fear exactly, but from the particular unsettled feeling of having been offered a bribe disguised as kindness, and having refused it in full knowledge of what refusal might cost her. She told Wesley of the exchange that night, and watched his jaw tighten with an anger he controlled with visible effort. "He is trying every angle now," Wesley said. "Sabotage the bridge to delay the trial, dine with the sheriff to intimidate the jury, and when the boy will not break and the trial proceeds anyway, try to buy you off the case entirely with a false clinic he would have controlled every day of your life. I do not like how many angles that man has." "I did not accept," Letitia said, a bit sharply, hearing something protective rising in his tone that she wanted to head off before it became something else. "I am capable of refusing a bribe without needing you to be angry on my behalf, Mr. Fletcher." Wesley caught himself, and to his credit, did not argue the point. "You are right," he said after a moment. "I am angry at him, not at your handling of it. You handled it exactly as it needed handling. I am only angry that he thought he could try it at all." "That anger I will accept," Letitia said, some of the sharpness leaving her voice. "I am angry too. I have spent 2 years building a reputation as a doctor who cannot be bought or frightened away from patients who need her, precisely because towns like this one need to know their physician answers to no one but her own conscience. If word got around that I had accepted Corrigan's clinic, every family I have ever treated would rightly wonder what else I might be persuaded to overlook. Then we agree it is a good thing you refused, and we can be angry at Corrigan together without it turning into an argument between us." Letitia looked at him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised out of her. That may be the first time in my life a man has managed to be protective of me without making me feel smaller for needing it, she said. I find I do not mind it nearly as much as I expected to. I am learning, Wesley said, and there was something in his voice, warm and a little rough, that made Letitia's breath catch slightly. It was 2 nights later, with the trial's verdict expected the following morning and the whole town humming with anticipation, that the county fair held its closing dance in the largest grain warehouse near the rail spur, cleared of its sacks and swept clean for the occasion, strung with lanterns against the cool October dark. Farmers and drovers and townsfolk alike crowded in for one last celebration of the harvest season before winter closed the roads, and Wesley found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, asking Letitia Talbot to walk over with him. "I do not dance particularly well," she warned him as they crossed the dusty street toward the warehouse's lantern glow. "Medical training does not leave much room for such lessons. Neither do 11 years driving wagons," Wesley admitted. "I expect we will manage something between the two of us that will not embarrass either party too badly." The warehouse was warm with bodies and lantern light, a fiddle and a guitar working through a lively reel while couples spun and stomped across the swept plank floor, and Wesley took Letitia's hand with a carefulness that made her chest tight in a way she had not felt since long before her husband's death. They danced, imperfectly, laughing more than once at their own missteps, and for a little while the danger hanging over the trial and the shadow of Corrigan's quiet violence seemed to recede into something distant and manageable, replaced by the simple pleasure of two tired, capable people finally allowing themselves a moment of lightness. Between dances, standing near the open warehouse doors where the cool evening air drifted in carrying the smell of wood smoke and cut grass, Wesley found himself studying Letitia's face in the lantern light, the flush of exertion and laughter still bright in her cheeks, and felt a wave of tenderness so strong it nearly took the words from him entirely. "Letitia," he said, using her given name for the first time since they had met, and watched her eyes widen slightly at the sound of it. "I have been trying to find the right way to say this for the better part of 2 weeks, and I do not believe there is a right way, so I am simply going to say it plain. I have come to care for you a great deal, not merely as a colleague in this business of keeping that boy alive, though I respect you more in that regard than any person I have worked beside in years. I mean I have come to care for you the way a man cares for a woman he cannot stop thinking about, whose safety concerns him not out of duty, but out of something considerably softer and considerably more permanent than duty." Letitia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face in the lantern light, and when she spoke her voice was unsteady in a way he had never heard from her before. "Wesley," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name either, and it settled something warm and certain in his chest to hear it. "I have spent 3 years building walls around exactly this kind of feeling, because the last time I let myself love a man fully, I lost him to a fever I could not cure, and I swore I would never again build my whole heart around someone I might have to bury. But I find, watching you these past 2 weeks, that the walls have not held nearly as well as I intended them to." "I am not asking you to give up your walls entirely," Wesley said. "I know better than most men what it costs a person to build a life out of the wreckage of a terrible loss. I am only asking whether there might be room, somewhere behind those walls, for a wagon master who has learned, rather later than he should have, that loving a capable woman means standing beside her rather than in front of her." Letitia's answer was not words at all, but the small, deliberate closing of the distance between them, her hand rising to rest against his chest, and Wesley bent his head and kissed her there in the lantern light near the warehouse doors, gentle and searching, and felt her answer it with a warmth that told him more plainly than any words could have that the walls she had spoken of had, indeed, found room for him behind them. They stood there a long moment after, foreheads nearly touching, both of them slightly breathless, and Letitia laughed softly, a sound of pure relief and wonder. "I did not expect this," she said. "Not from a job the judge forced upon me against my objections." "Neither did I," Wesley admitted. "I have spent 11 years telling myself a wagon master has no business wanting a settled thing, a home, a partner, because the road takes so much from a man that there is nothing steady left to offer anyone. I am beginning to think I told myself that because I had not yet met anyone worth changing the arrangement for." The dance ended not long after, the fiddle player calling a final tune before the fairgoers began drifting home to prepare for the trial's conclusion the next morning, and Wesley walked Letitia back through the cool, lantern-lit streets to the doctor's office, both of them quiet with the particular contentment of two people who had finally said aloud what had been building silently between them for 2 weeks. They did not know, standing at her door in the last warmth of that evening, that Silas Corrigan had watched the entire exchange in the warehouse from a shadowed corner near the grain sacks stacked outside, and that the sight of his intended purchase, Letitia Talbot's reputation and usefulness, growing so plainly attached to a wagon master with no fortune and no influence, had settled something cold and decisive in him that neither the bribe nor the sabotage had yet managed to accomplish. The verdict came the next morning, and it came against Corrigan's foreman. The jury, 12 men who had watched Amos Reyes hold his ground under 2 days of hostile questioning, and had watched Corrigan's own quiet intimidation campaign fail to break a 15-year-old boy's resolve, returned a verdict of guilty in barely 40 minutes of deliberation, and Judge Beeman sentenced Dietz to hang for the murder of Rafael Ochoa, a sentence to be carried out within the month pending the routine review by the territorial governor's office. The courtroom erupted, not with celebration exactly, but with the particular exhausted release of a community that had watched its law tested, and for once seen it hold. Letitia embraced Amos, who wept with relief now that the terrible weight of his testimony was finally behind him, and Wesley stood near the back of the room watching them both with a warmth he had not expected to feel over the conclusion of what had begun, for him, as simply another difficult contract. But the celebration did not last the day. That afternoon, as Wesley helped load supplies for what he expected would be Letitia's continued work in Ellsworth now that the trial had concluded, a rider came into town with grim news from the western edge of the county. 2 of Corrigan's men had been seen the night before near the doctor's office, and though nothing had happened, the sheriff, still uneasy in his own loyalties despite the verdict, warned that Corrigan was known to take defeats in court poorly, and that a man who had lost this much face publicly might seek to recover it privately, away from the eyes of judges and juries. The warning proved accurate faster than either Wesley or Letitia expected. That very evening, as the light failed and the town's celebration mood gave way to the ordinary business of a Kansas railhead settling into darkness, Letitia returned from a house call to a farming family on the edge of town to find the door of her clinic standing ajar, the lock broken, and inside, her cabinet of medicines overturned, bottles smashed across the floor, and a single note pinned to the wall with a knife. A warning, unsigned but unmistakable in its origin, that the county was not so easily won as one trial's verdict might suggest, and that certain doctors would do well to remember whose goodwill kept a practice safe in Corrigan country. Wesley arrived within minutes of her discovery, drawn by a passerby who had seen the broken door, and found Letitia standing amid the wreckage of her clinic with her jaw set hard against tears of pure furious frustration rather than fear. "He cannot touch the verdict," she said before Wesley could speak. "The trial is finished, the boy is safe, Dietz will hang regardless of anything Corrigan does now. This is not strategy, this is spite. Spite from a man who has just lost the one thing his money could not buy," Wesley said grimly, surveying the smashed bottles and overturned cabinets. "A public defeat. He cannot undo the verdict, so he means to make you pay for delivering it, and to remind this town that his reach still extends past any courtroom's walls. I will not be frightened out of this county, Wesley. I did not build this practice, this reputation, to abandon it the moment a wealthy man breaks a few bottles to prove a point. I am not asking you to abandon it. Wesley knelt among the broken glass, beginning methodically to gather what could be salvaged, giving his hands something to do while his mind worked through the danger. I am asking you to let me help you protect it, not because I doubt your capability, Letitia. Because two sets of eyes and hands can watch a door that one cannot watch alone, and because I find I have no intention of riding off to my next wagon contract, while a man like Corrigan holds a grudge against the woman I love. It was the first time he had said the word love plainly, in the midst of a mess of broken glass and half-formed danger rather than in the soft lantern light of a warehouse dance, and Letitia felt it land with a weight that steadied her more than any comfort could have. "You love me," she said, not quite a question. "I do. I have known it since somewhere around that river crossing, watching you stand your ground in front of 4 armed men without so much as a tremor in your voice, though I did not have the sense to say it plainly until just now, kneeling in your broken medicine cabinet, which I grant is not the romantic moment either of us might have chosen." Letitia laughed despite herself, a wet, relieved sound. "I love you too, Wesley Fletcher. I have thought it plainly since somewhere around that dance, though I confess I have been too frightened of what it might cost me to say it aloud until this exact, unromantic moment." They spent the rest of that evening cleaning the wreckage of the clinic together, and by the time the last shard of glass was swept away, they had also worked out, between them, a plan that satisfied both Wesley's need to see her protected and Letitia's insistence that the protection be a partnership rather than a decree handed down for her benefit without her input. "I will not run from Corrigan," Letitia said firmly, as they finished. "But I agree it would be foolish to pretend there is no danger left simply because the trial is over. I propose this. I will accept the sheriff's offer of a proper deputy posted near the clinic at night, since that much protection costs me nothing of my independence. It is simply the ordinary law doing its ordinary work. And you, Wesley Fletcher, if you are serious about not riding off to your next contract, might consider whether a wagon master's skills could find use in a town that badly needs someone capable of organizing supply runs and escort work for the very homestead families you have spent your life protecting. Work that would keep you near enough to Ellsworth that neither of us need choose between your calling and mine." Wesley considered this, turning it over with the same careful weight he gave any decision that mattered. "I have thought these past weeks that I might be tired of the long hauls," he admitted. "Not tired of the work itself, but tired of the leaving contract after contract, never staying long enough anywhere to build the kind of life I find I want now. Ellsworth is a railhead. There will be families needing guided escort to claims all through this county for years yet, wagon trains needing organizing, freight needing hauling safely past whatever danger the road holds. I could build a business here out of Ellsworth that keeps me close enough to ride home most nights rather than most seasons." "Home," Letitia repeated softly, testing the word. "If you would have me build one with you," Wesley said, and it was not quite a formal proposal, not yet, but it carried the shape of one clearly enough that Letitia's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "I would," she said. "Though I will remind you, Wesley Fletcher, that whatever home we build, my clinic comes with me. I do not intend to become a wife who waits by a window while her husband rides the roads and forgets she has work of her own worth doing." "I would never ask you to set it down," Wesley said. "I have watched you save that boy's life through sheer stubborn skill. I have watched you refuse a bribe that would have made your life considerably easier because it would have cost you your independence. And I have come to understand, slower than I ought to have, that loving you means loving all of that too, not merely the parts of you that fit easily into a quiet domestic picture. I want a partner, Letitia, not a decoration for my home. I have had enough of deciding things for people to last me the rest of my life. I would rather decide things with you instead." It was, perhaps, the truest declaration either of them had made yet, more binding in its way than the earlier confession of love, because it addressed plainly the very fear that had kept Letitia's walls standing for 3 years. The fear that loving a man, particularly a strong, capable, protective man like Wesley Fletcher, might mean surrendering the hard-won independence she had built her whole professional life around. Hearing him promise, in plain, unromantic terms amid the last of the swept glass, that he understood the difference between protecting her and controlling her, settled something in her that no amount of dancing or lantern-light kisses could have settled quite so completely. But Sela's Corrigan was not finished, and the danger that had broken her clinic's lock had not exhausted itself with a smashed cabinet and a single knife-pinned note. 3 days later, with Amos Reyes safely returned to his family on a small farm outside the county under the protection of a sympathetic neighbor, and with Dietz's execution scheduled for the following week pending the governor's routine review, word reached Wesley through one of his old contacts among the freight haulers that Corrigan had hired 4 new men from outside the county, gunfighters by reputation rather than ranch hands, and that they had been seen riding toward Ellsworth, with instructions nobody among the freight haulers cared to guess at aloud. Wesley brought the news to Judge Beeman immediately, and the judge, grim-faced, agreed that the danger had moved beyond what a single deputy could handle. "I will wire the territorial marshal's office again," the judge said, "and this time I will make certain the message carries enough urgency to be answered. But a wire takes time to send and longer to answer. Fletcher and Corrigan's hired men do not wait on paperwork." "Then we will need to handle the interim ourselves," Wesley said, "the same way we handled Purcell at the crossing, not with bullets first. With enough plain preparation and enough witnesses that no sensible hired gun wants to be the one who fires first in front of a whole town." It was Letitia who suggested the shape the preparation should take, drawing on the same instinct for careful strategy that had guided her through refusing Corrigan's bribe and standing her ground at the crossing weeks before. "Corrigan's whole method has been private violence dressed up as deniable circumstance," she said, as the 3 of them, Wesley, Letitia, and the judge, met that evening in the judge's chambers. "He has never once acted where the whole town could plainly see and plainly blame him. If we make certain that whatever confrontation comes happens in full view of Ellsworth citizens, with enough witnesses that no story he tells afterward can survive contradiction, we take away the one advantage his money has always bought him, deniability. You propose we simply wait for his men to come and hope the crowd deters them," Wesley said, uneasy. "I propose we make it impossible for them to succeed quietly," Letitia said. "You said yourself, at the crossing, that Purcell backed down not because he feared your rifle particularly, but because he feared the consequences of being seen to defy a federal marshal's coming authority. Let us give Corrigan's new men the same fear, multiplied by an entire town watching. Judge Beeman, if you were to announce publicly tomorrow, at the fair's closing market day, that the territorial marshal is expected within days specifically to investigate the sawed bridge pilings and the threats against a witness and a physician under this court's protection, and if that announcement is made before the whole gathered crowd of the fair, Corrigan's hired men will know that any violence they commit now happens under the eye of witnesses who will testify against them, the moment federal authority arrives to ask." Yes. Judge Beeman considered this with the slow deliberation of a man weighing a genuinely clever plan against its risks. "It is a bluff," he said finally. "The marshal has not yet answered my wire." "Purcell's retreat at the crossing was built on a bluff too," Wesley said slowly, seeing the shape of it now. "It worked because I said it plain and steady enough that he did not want to test whether it was true. This is the same principle, only played out before the whole town instead of 4 riders at a ford." "And if Corrigan calls the bluff," the judge asked, "then we deal with what comes in full view of the county rather than in the dark behind a broken clinic door," Letitia said. "I would rather face that danger honestly, in daylight, with the whole town as witness, than spend the rest of my life in Ellsworth waiting for the next knife pinned to a wall in the dark. It was, Wesley thought, watching her lay out the plan with the same steady clarity she brought to setting a broken bone, exactly the kind of courage and judgment that had made him fall in love with her in the first place, and he found himself, rather than wanting to overrule her plan with some more cautious alternative of his own devising, simply nodding his agreement. "I will stand beside you when it happens," he said. "Not in front of you. Beside you. That is the arrangement we agreed to." "That is the arrangement," Letitia confirmed, and something passed between them that was as much promise as strategy. The fair's closing market day arrived 2 days later, the last great gathering of the season before the harvest crowds dispersed, and Ellsworth settled into the quieter rhythms of winter, and the town square and the wide dusty street before the land office filled with farmers selling the last of their produce, cattle buyers finalizing contracts, and families enjoying the final festivities before the cold set in fully. Judge Beeman made his announcement from the land office steps at midday, his voice carrying clear and formal across the crowded square, declaring that the territorial marshal's office had been formally notified of evidence pointing to deliberate sabotage of the county's western bridge, and to threats made against witnesses and a physician under the court's protection, and that federal investigators were expected within the week to conduct a full inquiry. It was, as Letitia had predicted, a message aimed less at the crowd itself than at 4 particular men who stood near the edge of the square, having arrived in town only that morning, watching the judge's announcement with expressions that shifted from casual indifference to careful reassessment as the implications of federal inquiry settled over them. Wesley stood near the land office steps throughout the announcement, his rifle visible but not raised, exactly as it had been at Cottonwood Crossing weeks before, and Letitia stood beside him rather than behind him, her medical bag at her feet, both of them present as living evidence of exactly the witnesses the judge's announcement described. One of the 4 hired men, a lean rider with a scarred jaw who seemed to carry himself as the group's leader, stepped forward from the crowd's edge as the judge finished speaking, his hand resting near his holster in a gesture that drew immediate tension through the gathered onlookers, several of whom began edging back toward whatever cover the square afforded. "Judge," the man called out, his voice pitched to carry, "seems to me a man ought to be free to conduct his business in this county, without federal marshals sniffing after him over an old bridge that any fool could see was just rotten timber. The marshal's office will determine what it finds when it examines the evidence," Judge Beeman answered evenly from the steps. "I would remind you and your companions, sir, that this square is full of citizens who will remember plainly whatever happens here today, and federal inquiries have a particular interest in witnesses to violence against officers of this court and its protected persons." The rider's eyes moved across the crowd, taking in the scale of it, the dozens of farmers and drovers and fairgoers who had stopped their business to watch, the visible presence of Wesley's rifle and the sheriff's own deputies stationed at intervals around the square, and Wesley watched him do the same calculation Purcell had done at the crossing weeks before, weighing the value of whatever payment Corrigan had promised against the certainty of being named by dozens of witnesses, as the man who committed violence in broad daylight on the very day federal marshals were announced to be en route. "This is not over, Judge," the rider said finally, his voice carrying less certainty than his words intended. "Corrigan does not forget an insult. Then Corrigan may take that grievance up through this court, the same as any other citizen," Judge Beeman said. "I would advise you to ride on, sir, before your continued presence here becomes evidence of something the marshal's office will find considerably more interesting than a rotten bridge." The 4 men held their position a moment longer, and Wesley felt Letitia's hand find his, steady and warm, a small gesture of solidarity in front of the whole watching crowd that told him she had chosen, deliberately, to stand beside him in full view rather than retreat to safety. the same choice she had made at every danger point since the crossing. It was that image, perhaps, more than the judge's words or the visible rifles of Ellsworth's deputies, that finally decided the hired men. A woman standing unafraid beside a rifle-bearing man in front of an entire town, both of them plainly unwilling to be frightened into silence, made whatever payment Corrigan had promised look considerably less appealing than the certain trouble of a federal inquiry. The four riders turned and left Ellsworth within the hour, and though word came back weeks later that they had continued on toward Colorado rather than returning to Corrigan's employ at all, having decided the whole business was not worth whatever risk a federal marshal's attention might bring, the immediate effect in Ellsworth was a slow exhale of released tension throughout the crowded square, and the beginning, though none of them knew it fully yet, of the end of Silas Corrigan's quiet reign over the county's law. The territorial marshal did arrive, 9 days later, considerably delayed by the distance from Fort Riley and the press of other business, but arrived nonetheless, and his investigation into the sawed bridge pilings and the threats against Letish's clinic, combined with the already public record of the trial and Dietz's conviction, produced enough evidence that Silas Corrigan found himself, for the first time in a decade, facing genuine legal scrutiny, rather than the deniable shadow games he had relied upon for years. He did not go to prison himself, the evidence against him personally remaining circumstantial despite everyone's certainty of his involvement. But the marshal's inquiry broke something essential in the fear that had held the county in place, and in the months that followed, 2 more witnesses who had been too frightened to speak against Corrigan's operations in years past found the courage to bring their own complaints forward. Emboldened by the sight of a 15-year-old boy and a lady doctor who had stood their ground and won. Dietz hanged for his crime the week after the marshal's arrival, a grim but necessary closing to the violence that had begun the whole chain of events, and Judge Beeman's court, for the first time in years, began to feel to the people of Ellsworth County like an institution that might actually hold, regardless of whose money stood against it. Wesley Fletcher did not return to the long-haul contracts that had defined his 11 years on the trail. Instead, drawing on the reputation he had built guiding families safely across dangerous crossings, and now, on the added weight of having stood publicly against Corrigan's hired men without a single shot fired, he established a modest freighting and escort business out of Ellsworth itself, contracting with homestead families and grain merchants who needed safe passage along the county's roads, work that kept him within a day's ride of town more often than not, and allowed him, for the first time in more than a decade, to sleep most nights under a roof he considered his own rather than beneath a wagon on some unfamiliar stretch of trail. Letitia Talbot, for her part, accepted the county's offer, made through Judge Beeman rather than through any tainted overture from Corrigan, to establish Ellsworth's first properly funded permanent medical practice, built from public subscription among the grateful farmers and townsfolk, rather than from any single wealthy man's controlling purse. She kept the small clinic behind the old doctor's office, repaired now and considerably better stocked, and though she no longer needed to travel the itinerant circuit that had defined her practice for 2 years, she made clear to the town council, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that she would continue riding out to outlying farms and homestead claims whenever a patient's need required it, married or not, and that no arrangement of her personal life would ever again mean surrendering her right to practice medicine exactly as her own judgment saw fit. Their wedding took place in late November, on a clear cold day with the last of the autumn color gone from the cottonwoods along the Smoky Hill, and the first hard frosts silvering the grass each morning. A modest ceremony held in the same land office that had served as courtroom during the trial, attended by Judge Beeman, by Amos Rays and his grateful family who had traveled in for the occasion, by half the town it seemed. Farmers and drovers and shopkeepers who had watched the whole drama unfold across the harvest season and had come to feel, in the way small communities often did, a proprietary warmth toward the wagon master and the lady doctor whose courage had helped hold their counties law together against a rich man's private violence. Letitia wore a simple dress of deep blue wool against the November cold, her dark hair loose for once rather than pinned in its usual severe practicality. And Wesley, standing before Judge Beeman in his best coat with his rifle, for once, left entirely at home, thought he had never in his life seen anything so fine as the sight of her walking toward him across the land office floor. I have given a great many wagon trains my word that I would see them safely home, Wesley said, when the moment came for him to speak his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion plainly visible in his face. I have never given that word to anyone the way I give it to you now, Letitia. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you, for as long as we both shall live, and to remember, every day, that your judgment is worth as much as my protection, and that the greatest gift I can give you is not safety alone, but the freedom to choose your own path within it. I have spent 3 years building walls to keep myself safe from ever losing someone the way I lost my first husband, Letitia answered, her own voice thick with feeling she no longer troubled to hide. I did not expect a wagon master ordered against his will to travel with me would be the one to teach me that love and independence are not opposites, that a man could stand beside my strength rather than trying to replace it. I promise to be your partner in every sense of the word, Wesley Fletcher, in danger and in peace alike, and to trust you with my heart exactly as fully as I have come to trust you with my life. They were married before the assembled town, and the celebration that followed, held in the same warehouse where they had first danced together during the fair, ran long into the cold November evening, fiddle music and laughter, and the warm, crowded joy of a community that had weathered a hard season together and come through it whole. Late in the evening, when the dancing had quieted and most of the guests had drifted home against the deepening cold, Wesley found Letitia standing near the warehouse doors where he had first told her he loved her, looking out at the frost-bright stars over Ellsworth's quiet streets, and came to stand beside her, his arms settling naturally around her shoulders. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Judge Beeman's order, the standoff, all of it. If he had never forced us to travel together, we would neither of us be standing here." "I regret none of it," Letitia said, leaning into him with a contentment that had taken her 3 long years to allow herself. "Though I will admit, when I stood in that ford at Cottonwood Crossing watching you refuse to raise your rifle against 4 armed men, I did not imagine I was watching the moment a wagon master would trade every hardened instinct of 11 years on the trail for something as uncertain as trust in a woman he had known less than a week. I did not know it myself that day," Wesley admitted. "I only knew that raising that rifle would have solved nothing and might have cost everything, and that the woman standing beside me, refusing to step back from a sick boy's wagon, deserved better than a man who solved every problem with force alone. I traded the rifle for something better that day, Letitia. I traded it for the beginning of learning how to trust you, and I have not once regretted the exchange." Above them, the Kansas sky stretched vast and clear and full of cold autumn stars, the kind of sky that had watched over 11 years of Wesley's wagon trains and 3 years of Letitia's lonely medical circuit before ever bringing the two of them together at a ruined bridge, and a standoff that ended, against every expectation, without a single shot fired. Below it, in the quiet warmth of a town that had learned, through their courage, that its law could hold against even the wealthiest man's private violence, Wesley Fletcher and Letitia Talbot stood together, finally and fully each other's safest place in a world that had given neither of them an easy road to find it. Ellsworth settled into winter not long after, its cattle pens emptied of the season's drives, its harvest wagons stored until spring, its rail spur quiet under the year's first true snow. Letitia's clinic saw a steady stream of patients through the cold months, farmers with frostbitten hands, children with winter fevers. The ordinary steady work of a permanent physician finally rooted in soil that had needed her for years. And Wesley's freighting business grew steadily as word spread of the wagon master who had stood against Corrigan's men, without firing a shot, and who now guided county freight and homestead families alike with the same careful competence that had once carried wagon trains the whole long distance from Independence. They built a small house at the edge of town that winter, close enough to Letitia's clinic that she could walk to it in minutes, close enough to the freight yards that Wesley could see to his own business without long absences from home. And if the marriage that grew inside that small house through that first winter and into the spring that followed was not without its ordinary disagreements, the small frictions of two strong-willed, capable people learning to share a life rather than simply a cause, it was built. From its very foundation, on the hard one understanding both of them had reached across the harvest season of 1878. That love, properly built, made neither of them smaller, and that the truest partnership was the one where protection and respect walked hand in hand, exactly as they had learned to walk together, from a ruined bridge at Cottonwood Crossing to a warm November wedding beneath the wide Kansas sky.